really positive impact can happen at the local level. And the more engaged people are within their communities, reaching out to their state legislators, the more progress we'll make on these issues. Even if, for example, encounter headwinds at the federal level and a lack of support on certain issues there, at the local level and at the state level, we can make progress. And people in their communities can absolutely make a difference.
You're listening to Granite Goodness, the show about optimism, problem-solving, solutions, and progress in New Hampshire. My name is Andy DeMeo, and today I'm coming to you from Treeline Outfitters in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. My guest today is Tom Irwin. Tom is the Vice President and New Hampshire Advocacy Center Director at the Conservation Law Foundation. We talk about how Tom's work with communities across New England helps promote healthier environments for humans and reduces pollution. We talk about the different tools environmental lawyers use and whether David versus Goliath is an accurate view of environmental law, why Tom is optimistic about the future of his work, and many other things on this episode of Granite Goodness. Tom Irwin, welcome to Granite Goodness.
Thanks very much, Andy. Great to be here with you.
I'm very glad to have you here. We met at the Alnoba Awards dinner a couple months back.
That's right.
It was a very, very brief interaction. I think there was some singing. We had done some singing.
That's right. There was a brief moment of that.
Not just you and I, everyone.
Definitely not just you and I. That would not have been, well, speaking from my singing ability, it would not have been good.
I'm with you. Maybe next time you and I we'll do a duet for the Alnoba people. That was a fun time though. It's a good, have you been there before?
I have. Yeah. It's a great facility. Actually, Conservation Law Foundation, we frequently meet there. We've had a few all-staff retreats there, and of course, Alnoba does a great job recognizing environmental leaders throughout the region and beyond. So, yeah, it's really a great event where we had the opportunity to meet.
Yeah, I was really impressed. I'd never been there. I'd like to go back. I should get them on the show at some point, too. They'd be great folks.
Definitely.
But anyway, we always start these shows, Tom, talking a little bit about your relationship with New Hampshire, with the Granite State. It's okay if you live in Massachusetts. Some people do. A couple of them I hear. But why don't you tell me about, are you from here? Do you live around here? What do you like about New Hampshire? Let's dig into that.
Well, first, I love New Hampshire. I'm not a native. I cannot claim that status, but I've lived in New Hampshire for 27 or 28 years. I currently live in Portsmouth, moved to Portsmouth about 3.5 years ago. Before that, lived in Concord for about 25 years and raised a family there and have just always really enjoyed the state.
You're a big fan.
I am.
Those are some pretty strong credentials. So how did you end up here? Where are you from?
I'm originally from Western Massachusetts, but also spent a good chunk of my childhood in Florida.
No
Two
kidding.
very different places.
Okay, this is interesting because I'm actually from Florida. People are always like, were you born on a slab of granite on top of Mount Washington? Because the show is all about New Hampshire. I'm like, no, I was actually born in Orlando. Moved here very, very young. I think every time I tell the story on air, my mom is like, no, you weren't shipped here when you were a baby. But I think I moved here when I was 2 years old. I don't know. But there is this weird, the Florida, Massachusetts, New Hampshire pipeline is stronger and thicker than people think it is. My dad lives in Marco Island now, and he was just telling me the other day how he's thinking of starting a bagel place, but styled after Massachusetts, kind of almost like a Dunkin' Donuts. They don't have Dunkin' Donuts, and he's like, there's a lot of ex-New England, Massachusetts people here who would relish some kind of cuisine like that. So I'd be remiss not to remark on the Mass Florida connection. My brother lives in Northampton.
Okay.
So I'm there all the time.
Yeah.
When you moved to New Hampshire, when did you feel like you knew it was a place that you were going to want to stay?
Immediately.
Yeah.
My wife and I moved actually to Portsmouth it was just the right place from a location perspective for our two jobs for a year. I lived here for a year around 1995, loved Portsmouth. Ended up moving to Concord because that's what made the most sense for our respective jobs at the time.
Yeah.
And as I said, we were there for about 25 years. Loved it. Yeah, I've never thought about living anywhere else.
Yeah. I'm always fascinated to hear the different stories people have when they're like, oh, maybe I didn't originally see myself here, but then I met a community of people or had an experience, and then it was like, oh, suddenly it started to feel like home. All right. Take me into your career a little bit. So you're in a very environmentally focused role now, but before we get into that, like, can you give us the long and short version? How does Tom Irwin end up at the Conservation Law Foundation? Were you always interested in environmentalism?
I became interested in environmental work shortly after graduating from college. Did about 2 years of grassroots environmental work for a group called Clean Water Action. Worked on a number of issues. Waste was a big issue that we worked on. And in the course of that work, it became clear to me that I wanted new tools to be able to be more effective or have a different impact, at least, than in the work I was doing. So that led me to law school.
Yeah.
I went to Vermont Law School, which has a pretty strong specialty in environmental law.
Yeah.
And I went there with the hopes of doing exactly the type of work I'm doing now.
Yeah.
But out of law school, I spent a year clerking for a judge in Maine, and then from there went into private practice at Divine Millamette and Branch in Manchester. I was there for about 2.5 years, and then CLF opened its doors in New Hampshire.
Okay.
And I was fortunate enough to land a position there, and I've been there ever since.
So you've been there a long time.
Yeah, about 25 years.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Wow. So you straight up, like, maybe for people who don't know so much about legal careers, which that includes myself, take us a little bit through, like, what is the sort of work that you started out doing? Like, when you say I went and clerked for a judge, what does that mean?
Judicial clerkship is working closely with a judge, and I think clerkships vary depending on whether you're at a trial court level or an appellate level. I clerked for a judge who was on the Maine Supreme Judicial Court, so that was appellate work, and it was very much researching the law, writing memos and recommendations to the judge that I worked with.
Yeah.
And so it's a really good and interesting experience.
Sure.
And a good skills builder as well.
So soon after that, you joined CLF.
I went into private practice after that, and then Conservation Law Foundation. So when I went to CLF, I joined the organization as a staff attorney. It was pretty active in terms of litigation. I worked on a variety of issues in my early years at CLF. Transportation was a big focus of my practice, sprawl, land use type issues.
Sure.
But the work has evolved over the years, and it's always been very interesting and challenging.
I was going to say, like, you have this unique position of not only being in the same field for a long time, but being at the same organization for a while. Like, I know a little bit about environmental work and studied a little bit, but people are going to listen to this they have absolutely no idea. So we're gonna try and demystify some of this for them. When you say that you're a staff attorney and that you were working on issues of transportation and sprawl, right, early on, like, what does that mean?
Well, at Conservation Law Foundation, we use different tools. Mm-hmm. So some of that work was policy oriented.
Yeah.
Some of that work was litigation oriented when necessary.
Yeah.
Some of the work was in the legislature, working to strengthen or improve New Hampshire's laws around transportation.
Have you found that when you say the work has changed over time, like, what do you mean by that?
It's changed in a few ways. There have certainly been certain constants. Mm-hmm. So, for example, Conservation Law Foundation has for quite some time used the Clean Water Act as an important tool to clean up our local water resources. Mm-hmm. So here on the Seacoast, for example, we engaged in active advocacy for many years using the Clean Water Act to protect the Great Bay estuary.
Yeah.
The big pollutant of concern for protecting the estuary was nitrogen pollution. Actually, it still is nitrogen pollution.
Yeah.
And so we were able to use the Clean Water Act as a tool to basically change the regulatory landscape in the Great Bay Estuary watershed
Yeah.
in a way that required wastewater treatment plants to upgrade and dramatically reduce their pollution loads.
Yeah.
So that's certainly a constant. So water resources has long been a concern and an emphasis, and using that federal law as a tool to achieve
Yeah.
progress. Not surprisingly, climate change is a
Right.
major issue of concern and a major focus of our work at CLF. It was not in the late 90s when I joined CLF.
It was global warming back then.
Well, that's right. It was.
I remember.
Yes. But since then, it has become a major focus of our work. It really runs through all our advocacy, including our Clean Water Act advocacy. So that work has involved both working to get us off dirty energy, dirty fossil fuels like coal-fired power,
Right.
and at the same time working to make New Hampshire more energy efficient and to build out a clean energy economy, to decarbonize our electric system, to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions impacts of the transportation sector. So that is a major emphasis. But I would say most recently, a major ongoing concern has been the issue of environmental justice.
Sure.
And that is, there are certain communities, lower income communities, it can be communities of color, that historically and still to this day experience disproportionate environmental harm.
Right.
And at the same time, have inequitable access to environmental benefits.
Yeah.
So the environmental justice movement is about working to correct those inequities.
Yeah.
And so Conservation Law Foundation has, for quite some time, been working to advance environmental justice in Massachusetts. That work more recently has expanded into northern New England.
Yeah.
And for the last 10 years or so, we've been doing quite a bit of that work here in New Hampshire.
Yeah. I remember I took a class in college that was about this. So you're like, you've got 20 years experience, and I'm like, I took one class about this in college, and I'm going to tell you about it. But I distinctly remember the first moment. Like, I think for a lot of people, these ideas can feel abstract, right? When people you say or hear the term environmental justice, like, what does that even mean? And it's like, you can look on a graph on like the EPA website and say, oh, this community is mostly African-American people or Hispanic and Latino people. And you can literally look at like the different pollution factors that are affecting every county, every municipality. And the data shows worse pollution and worse outcomes on all these different parts of life. They're correlated with different racial categories. And that's an extremely broad inference to make, obviously. Like, I encourage people to dig into all this data, but it's getting at the complicated truth behind some of these like abstract statistics is like important, because it's all human oriented at the end of the day.
Yeah,
it's all connected.
The Environmental Protection Agency has assembled some really powerful data around that. They have an environmental justice screening tool.
I think that's what I'm thinking of.
Okay, yeah, and you can look at any community on a census tract basis.
Wow.
So you can zoom in on Manchester, for example, and you can compare census tracts within the city, and the screening tool goes through a number of criteria, including life expectancy.
Sure.
And it is powerful data.
Yeah.
And it shows that, unfortunately, the zip code you live in absolutely can affect how long you're going to live.
Right.
So there are real disparities in terms of exposure to pollutants, exposure to various environmental harms, and again, lack of access to certain environmental benefits.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a really important area. And I think to really boil it down, because I agree with you, it feels very conceptual.
Right.
I think a great example is in Nashua. There was an asphalt plant that was being proposed to be located in very close proximity to a community that was predominantly Latino,
Yeah.
demographically also lower income. And this was a facility that was going to involve more than 200 trucks per day
Yeah.
coming through. And we worked very closely with partners in the community, with residents in the community, to make sure their voices were heard. And fortunately, the planning board there made the right call.
Yeah.
They determined that this proposed plant was not suited for this community,
Right.
and denied local approval. But that's, I think, a classic environmental justice issue where you have a community that already is exposed to various burdens, and then adding this additional very significant burden onto that,
Yeah.
onto their plate, would be a real injustice and further exacerbate health and other problems.
NIMBYism is a term that gets thrown a lot now, and for people listening, it means not in my backyard. And if you work in really any kind of zoning policy of any kind, you're probably used to hearing it. And the standard use or narrative of this term is like, hey, there's something that someone wants to build, but people lobby or advocate to have it not built near them because they don't want a new apartment or something, or they don't want an ugly feature. Infamously in Massachusetts, there's the debate about the offshore wind and the people viewing of the horizon line and all these things. But I'd be remiss not to talk about the philosophy and debate about NIMBYism with you, Tom, because it is the example you just gave about that community in Nashua, right? It's interesting because some business ostensibly has a need to build an asphalt plant or processing facility, right? And like in theory, nothing wrong with that, right? Like it's their business, they're growing, they're trying to do the thing. But as you mentioned, a lot of the time, these particular communities, again, they have a history of being sidelined, of not having the resources or knowledge to advocate for themselves. People don't advocate for them, right? Because they're not in the nice zip code, et cetera. And this would be just the latest kind of thing thrown at them. How do you think about all that?
Well, I think there are, it's a broad term.
Yeah.
And it's one thing to oppose a small apartment building that's being built nearby. It's quite another to be dealing with, say, a landfill.
Sure.
A facility that will have significant health impacts, quality of life impacts for a community. And those types of facilities typically end up being sited
Right.
in communities that don't have the same level of power as perhaps wealthier communities, that are vulnerable in some way,
Yeah.
politically. And I think that is how communities often end up having multiple facilities or
Right.
an accumulation of impacts from various activities. And so I think we need to recognize that happens, and it is happening.
Yeah.
And we need laws and policies to protect communities, because as long as it's easy to site a landfill in a poor community,
Right.
and just sort of be done with it,
Yeah.
that makes it a lot easier for everyone else to not think about where their waste is going, for policymakers to not deal with the challenges of how do we really solve, say, the waste crisis?
Yeah.
Because we do have a crisis.
Sure.
In New Hampshire, we've built more landfill capacity than surrounding states.
Yeah.
And we are filling those landfills with waste from out of state. More than about 50% of the waste that's buried in New Hampshire landfills is being trucked in from other states.
Wow.
So if I think there's a really important role for communities to stand up and say, hey, this is going to have a significant impact on our health.
Yeah.
They absolutely should be empowered to push back. And we need, as I said, laws and policies that protect those communities and that also get to the core of the problem. And so for waste, for example, how do we reduce the amount of waste that we are generating? How do we recycle more?
Yeah.
How do we make landfilling or incineration of waste the absolute last resort?
Right.
Right now, it's the first resort.
Yeah. I remember, again, this is just like my lay person's experience of this issue, but I think a couple of years ago, China changed their policy of what kinds or how much waste material or recycled, quote unquote, recycled material that they would accept. And a lot of towns, they maybe didn't know it, like, or a lot of people didn't know it worked this way, but I guess we were just shipping a lot of our mixed recycled stuff to China, and they would kind of deal with it, and then they've upped their standards, and it's like, whoa, okay, we can't, like, that had a big upstream effect, and the prices of dealing with all that stuff went up in a bunch of towns.
Yeah, a major source of that problem was, as you were saying, we were shipping mixed recyclables, so single stream recycling. So right now, in most places, we put paper, glass, cardboard, various plastics into the recycling bin, and we all assume it's all going to be recycled. And that is not the case, unfortunately. Unfortunately, that system of single stream mixing everything results in contamination. Glass gets broken, and that contaminates the whole mix of recyclables.
Yeah.
That's just one example. But contamination is a significant problem, and it stems from single stream recycling, and that is what led China to start rejecting the massive amounts of waste that we were shipping to them.
Yeah.
And included in that is the myth of plastics recycling.
Sure.
Very little plastic is recycled. I think at the highest point of recycling in the United States, about 9% was being recycled.
That's not very much.
No, not at all, especially when you think about how much plastic is being generated.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, the plastics industry has done a real number selling people on the notion that you can keep consuming single-use plastics. Don't worry, it's going to be recycled.
Yeah.
That is not the case.
Right.
Most of the time it is not recycled, and so we've got these mixes of ones, twos, fours, fives, and so different types of plastics, some that can be recycled more easily than others, but the bottom line is very little is happening in terms of plastics recycling. And what the industry is trying to do now is what they call chemical or advanced recycling. And it's sort of a brilliant greenwashing term.
Sure.
Because it's not really recycling the way we think of it. It's about using chemical processes or high heat to break down plastics and, in most cases or many cases, separate certain components and burn it.
Yeah.
So it's more akin to incineration.
Yeah. That's definitely not what I have in mind when
when you hear the term recycling.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Man, but man, that's so interesting. I feel like I'm one of those people we separate out. Like, I can't do mixed use in our town. Not that it sounds like it would do much anyway, but I separate my stuff out. I have the different bins, and I'm like, man, am I a sucker for doing this? But I know it's like, that's the thing that I like about your work is you kind of get at the core of all the stuff, right? Of the problem isn't necessarily like me, Joe Schmo. Am I sorting my recycles or not, right? It's far, far bigger than that, but it doesn't have to be that way. Right.
It doesn't. And I think you're exactly right. I think the plastics industry, for example, let me zoom out and say just the oil majors, oil and gas, they have been very effective, say, on the issue of climate change in trying to impose the burden on us as individuals to do certain things. And granted, there are things we can all do to reduce our footprint.
Right.
But to the point you were making, absolutely, at a much larger scale, those industries could have acknowledged the reality of climate change. Right. They knew about it. I mean, the oil majors, they knew climate change was happening. There is documentation of that. And yet, at the same time, have fought to undermine meaningful regulations and policies to tackle the threat of climate change. Not just the threat, the reality of what we're seeing now from climate change. So there are, as you were saying, there are decisions at certain levels that could have been made in a way to put us on a much different trajectory than we are currently on.
Yeah.
In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, for example, climate pollution.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad that you pointed that out. I think it's well deserved, and I understand why they have such a cynical view, right, of the private sector, of the corporate world, and because they hear all these stories of like, whoa, a lot of money is thrown at like marketing so that people aren't held accountable for the pollution. I mean, it's a tale as old as time. This idea that big polluters get away with stuff because they're rich, and the people who oppose them aren't, right? And I'm sure much of that narrative is true, and I kind of want to dig into that with you. But so much of this show, Tom, is I try and make it about like the world's not a zero-sum place. It's like we don't have to be enemies with people. But when you observe a coordinated kind of like pseudo cartel of powerful organizations working in concert in a way that I think you can make a compelling argument is maybe just based in selfishness and a kind of greed, and it makes framing things harder, right? Framing the non-zero sum. It's like, wow, I don't know that you're working in the best interests of the world and people, and it goes a little bit beyond like this fundamental question of what is the role of business? Like, are we looking after the shareholders? How are they getting paid, et cetera, et cetera? Like people always use that and they talk in those terms. And like if I was gonna try and make the best possible argument for what is great about the big baddies, the fossil fuel, right? I would say something like, look, the world 100 years ago was energy poor. Like we didn't have a lot of the energy resources we have today. More energy is generally a good thing. It lets us power our society. We have technology, et cetera, better prosperity. Like that's a great thing. And I think that's often the line that's thrown at people of like, well, without us, would you rather have no energy at all? And I think that's like, I agree with that, but I think it's a bit of a cop-out, to be honest, because as you said, it didn't have to go this way. And there's many, like, in my view, rational reasons why people are skeptical of the interests of big oil, just because we rely on them in many ways to do all these different things. It doesn't mean all the nastier stuff isn't true, or that there aren't many good examples of corporate entities that aren't acting that way. I feel like there's plenty of examples of that.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, though. So in terms of energy, it's not a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
So, for example, you're right. I mean, the oil industry had decades of extraction, shaping the economy, building their own private wealth. And the question is, why did they not use those resources that their capital, the capital they had developed, to use technologies to start to make that transition?
Right.
The transition that's happening now could have started much sooner.
Yeah.
Had big oil, which again internally knew the path they were putting us on in terms of climate change, had they chosen a different path at that time,
right,
and started the energy transition. Instead, they were entrenched and fought hard to defend their status quo, and here we are. Right. So with less time to address the climate crisis. But I'm optimistic that we will address it.
Right.
It's happening. We don't have a lot of time, but I'm optimistic that
we're here. We have the time we have. Something that I often talk about on the show, right, is that there is a notion of progress in even the way that we talk about things, or the way that we think about or examine like what questions are worth asking, right? Like even the existence of like the environmental justice movement, which I'm sure goes back further than the time that term has kind of made its way into common parlance, but like this idea that we're out here sitting and saying, wow, we're really trying to understand in a very detailed, human-oriented way, what does the lifelong impact of someone's environment look like for them on a health and pollution level and all that stuff. Like, I don't think anyone was concerned with that question 100 years ago, for example, right? Probably a bunch of other problems they had, or even like a lot of your work, I think you could put in that category where it's like, we're working hard, we're pushing on things, but in some ways the existence of these fights, you can squint and see that it's a sign of progress, right? That like we can have abundantly healthy communities and plenty of energy and have everyone have a good, happy, healthy life. Like, I don't know that that was always possible because of technology or the way that society was organized. So that's just my view. Tell me what you think of how we frame issues over time and the little victories we have along the way.
Well, I do think that, there's more and more information being put out. So I'm thinking about plastics, for example. I think the impacts in our daily lives of plastics, microplastics that we all now have in our bodies, that's becoming more and more known to people.
Right.
And that will have an impact.
Yeah.
That will have an impact on where that industry goes and hopefully the regulation of that industry in a way to better protect human health and the health of the environment. Along those lines, one of the things you hear people talking about more and more are PFAS, these forever chemicals.
Right.
Chemicals that have a broad range of health effects, including carcinogenic effects, adverse impacts on reproduction, cognitive abilities. These chemicals are highly pervasive, lasting in the environment, lasting in our bodies for a long time.
Yeah.
But the public is catching on to this,
right.
and things are happening that I think will reshape certain industries and reduce those impacts. For example, in New Hampshire,
there was
last
a law
session,
past summer,
last session there was a law passed. It goes into effect in 2027 that will ban the sale of a broad range of products that contain intentionally added PFAS. That's really where we need to start. The problem with PFAS is it's really hard to regulate at the back end.
Sure.
You really need to go upstream as far as possible, and that really is to the how and why PFAS are being used and dramatically reduce their use.
Yeah. Well, I will say, I'd be remiss not to mention, there's a whole little display over there for Nemo Equipment, which is outdoor adventure gear manufacturer based in Dover, and they're one of the world leaders in this space. And they were ahead of the game on this. Their head of sustainability, Teresa McKinney, came on. She told me all about PFAS, and they passed this law in California, and the company was like, all right, this is the way. They wanted to do it anyway because they just wanted to build a better backpack or whatever. But in the beginning, she framed it like this, Tom. She said, in the beginning, the whole industry was like, this is impossible. We need PFAS. We have to have them. And then the law changed, and it was all of a sudden it wasn't so impossible anymore. So I think when you frame the regulations and the laws, right, as tools, so to speak, to kind of advance these agendas for human environmental health, I think that's the right. I like that language because it shows. And we have a living, breathing example right down the street of the company is alive and well, and they don't put PFAS in a lot of their stuff anymore.
Absolutely, and by being ahead of the curve, I'm sure they have more clients. They've got more people buying their product. And to your point earlier, I mean that's an example of a company that's doing the right thing.
Right, man. So I would like to hear you share a little bit about. Let's dig into this David and Goliath thing, right? When people say the bad guys get away with it, big polluters get away with it, they have all the money, and the people who fight against them don't, and they always lose. I feel like your work is upending that notion. You guys fight these fights, you try and hold these big players accountable in all these ways that maybe they think of themselves as unaccountable. Is that an accurate way to view the work that you do?
It can often feel like a David Goliath type situation. Not always, but sometimes. But I think the equalizer is the judiciary. So that's where if we have good laws, organizations like Conservation Law Foundation or people who are harmed in certain ways can seek to enforce those laws and hopefully get good results.
Yeah.
So I think a classic, a true David and Goliath type scenario is CLF. By now, it's probably 6 years ago, we sued ExxonMobil related to the vulnerability of a major oil terminal in Chelsea, Massachusetts.
Yeah.
An oil terminal that was putting a low-income community at great risk in the event of a severe weather event.
Yeah.
And so we brought a lawsuit against them. That was absolutely hard fought. That was settled not too long ago. And that facility, ExxonMobil has walked away from that facility, and it is being transitioned to something that will be much cleaner.
Wow.
But climate was very much at issue
Yeah.
in that litigation. And like I said, it was certainly hard fought. And
Yeah, that's a victory, though.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, yeah, as I was saying, not everything is a David and Goliath type situation. But one of the things I'm proudest of, especially living in Portsmouth, is we worked using the Clean Water Act to push for the upgrade of the Pierce Island wastewater treatment plant. So that's the largest wastewater treatment plant on the seacoast. It had what was called advanced primary treatment. So in terms of the levels of treatment, it was at a very basic level.
Yeah.
And so we used the Clean Water Act to push EPA, and that ultimately led to the city of Portsmouth making a significant investment in that facility. And it is now absolutely state of the art.
Wow.
And with major reductions in the pollution load that was going into the Piscataqua River and having an impact up into Little Bay and pretty far upstream
Yeah.
on the incoming tide.
Yeah.
But the city of Portsmouth now is being very proactive, which is great. They made that really important investment.
Right.
And they've had a huge positive impact from having done so. They are actively working on stormwater pollution, reducing nitrogen loads from that source as well. So I especially now that I live in Portsmouth, I'm particularly proud of
Sure.
that work that we did here and work that we continue to do throughout the Seacoast region on the Great Bay Estuary.
But when you have outcomes like that, maybe like talking to the city of Portsmouth about, hey, this is actually in your interest to make these investments, when you do try and have these interactions with governments or businesses or communities even, how do you open those conversations?
Definitely. Yeah, we litigation is a tool that we use when necessary. Sometimes just the ability to litigate is enough, having that leverage. It's not always. Right now, we are back to the issue of PFAS pollution. We're very concerned about PFAS pollution from the city of Manchester's wastewater treatment plant.
Mm-hmm.
That wastewater treatment plant is the largest wastewater treatment plant in northern New England. And it's unique in New Hampshire in that it's the only wastewater treatment plant that incinerates its sewage sludge. What that means is there is PFAS pollution coming into the plant, into the wastewater treatment plant. We know that. They have data showing that. What that means is that PFAS are being discharged out of the wastewater treatment plant into the Merrimack River, but PFAS also get bound up in the sludge that is incinerated on site, creating an air exposure.
Oh, wow.
So we're very concerned about that, and we are hoping that the city of Manchester will be proactive. There are steps they can do. I mentioned earlier, especially with PFAS, because the nature of that pollution, the best thing you can do is go upstream.
Yeah.
There are a handful of industrial users that are sending that PFAS pollution to the wastewater treatment plant.
Right.
The city has the legal right and ability to regulate those upstream industrial users. And so we are asking the city to be proactive and do that to protect the community from from those exposures.
I'm glad you mentioned that too, because people often frame these things as opposites, right? That as though it's not in business interest to lead on the environment or to dispose of your waste appropriately. I heard this stat, like you want to talk about the impact of some of this stuff. Like, I think it's something like 80 to 200,000 Americans each year. They die premature deaths because of air pollution from either transportation or power generation emissions from fossil fuel. That's a real thing. Like, that's like an MIT paper from 10 years ago. I remember reading about sometime, and I might have the specific numbers, but like, it's a large number, and it's a concerningly large number. And if people want to talk about the health of the economy, it's like, man, having all those people continuing to be alive and interacting with businesses and all these things, like, not to be cynical or to zoom out to be like the only measure is how's the economy doing, but the economy as a proxy for like the aggregate of human well-being, like is there activity, are people exchanging goods and services, right? Like all those things. When you view it from that lens, it'd be like, we want those people alive and healthy and happy, right? That's good for business too. So I always like to try and think of things through that lens. How do you, like, when people say to you, this is too expensive, or like, boy, the environment, what a pain, we don't want to deal with that, it's bad for business. Like, how would you tackle that if someone said that to you?
I think when someone says some solution is too expensive, often they're looking at the costs,
right,
in a very narrow way. They are ignoring, for example, the health costs of allowing the status quo to continue.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of often widening the lens to capture the true costs of pollution coming out of a facility, or
right,
some externality. And when you factor in, when you broaden that lens and factor in those costs, that argument often goes away.
It looks like a better deal, or a smarter investment to make, right?
But I think the bottom line is there's always a fundamental question, especially if you're dealing with a private actor, an ExxonMobil, for example, or a private corporation that is engaged in an activity with a profit motive. There's nothing wrong with that, but
right,
but the question is, in doing so, are they imposing costs on others? Are there externalities that they should be required to internalize? So, so to maximize profits, should a corporation be allowed to emit pollution in a way that is going to shorten the lives of people?
Right.
I can tell you where I come down on that, and where CLF comes down on that. Our view is that technology
I agree.
and regulations should be used to support both a healthy economy, but also healthy people and communities.
There's good examples of corporate leaders and all these things, but fundamentally, the law really is an important place for these things to be like adjudicated, right? I mean, you've referenced the Clean Water Act a couple of times, like the three big ones. There's like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and there's the National Environmental Policy Act. I'm sure there's others. When you're looking at the toolbox, right, of working on these issues, like, are those laws, are they in need of updating? Are there new laws that you'd like to see come into place at the federal or state level? Like, how do those things interact?
Well, a couple things. I think at the moment, what's needed is to defend what we have in terms of the Clean Water Act and the National Environmental Policy Act. There are efforts, and there have been for some time, to weaken those laws. So I think, first and foremost, making sure we don't lose ground is really important. But the law and the policy that we really need in a significant way is the laws and policies we need are around climate change, to reduce climate pollution and to ensure that communities are more resilient to the impacts that we're already seeing.
Yeah.
And here in New Hampshire, we are the one state in New England that does not have a climate law. All around us. So, for example, Maine, Massachusetts, Vermont, they have laws that are designed on an economy-wide basis to significantly reduce climate pollution up through the year 2050. And New Hampshire has not adopted a law of that type yet.
But we do participate in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, right?
Yes.
That's a good thing. People always forget about Reggie.
Yes, but it's
much more
not
than
enough.
That. Yeah, it's not enough.
Not enough on its own. And then, of course, on the federal level, the Inflation Reduction Act was a very important piece of legislation, but arguably there are aspects of that could be in jeopardy. And the bottom line is we really do need leadership from the federal level that we've not had before all of this is to say that when things aren't happening at the federal level, it really increases the importance of what we do on the state level, which is why we need to take more action in New Hampshire on the state level, for example, to address the climate crisis. And it also ramps up the importance of action at the local level.
Right.
And a really exciting development in recent years in New Hampshire has been the New Hampshire Community Power Coalition.
Yeah, very positive.
Yes. So under that model, I think there are now more than 65 cities and towns across New Hampshire who have bought into this model where cities and towns are purchasing electricity for their residents, selling it to them at a rate that's lower than the utilities rate.
Right.
And they're providing cleaner energy, including with the option to buy 100% clean energy. So right here in Portsmouth, residents can do that. They can check a box, and the rate is a little bit higher, but they can check a box and purchase 100% clean energy.
Yeah. Well, even to have the option, right? I think you would find a lot of people out there. I mean, it's a really sticky question, right? Like when you ask people, hey, you care about climate? Okay, how much would you pay, right? And in some ways, like, that's the wrong question to ask because, as you say, like, these things are so much bigger than the average person. But harnessing the enthusiasm and the energy that is there to self-organize in the ways that we are capable of from the bottom up, right? Like, I think that's a great example. This idea that changing the law or creating the program so that communities and the municipal managers can self-organize to join this movement, to join this coalition, and actually increase residential demand for green energy, right? Like, that's a really cool outcome. And I it's a very good granted goodness thing, Tom, because it's an example of, like, this is a resource that we already have in abundance. It's just a matter of taking advantage of it. And I like to think of your work in the same way, right? Of all the things that you fight for at CLF, they are in everybody's interest, in my view. I mean, I'm passionate to the environment. I feel like it's the big issue, should be for everybody. But it's in everyone's interest to live a healthy, long life without pollution. And we can do that for everyone with it. Like, we have the technology. The only thing standing in the way is, like, the political will and all these things.
No, I think that's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I completely agree.
Yeah.
And a lot of it does boil down to political will. Do
Yeah.
we have the political will to do certain things?
Yeah. All right, Tom, take me through some optimism. Tell me some things that make you optimistic about the future of your work at CLF.
I'm optimistic about our work first and foremost because we have amazing supporters and have, as a result, been able to significantly increase our capacity to do more work and take on more issues. So that gives me great hope because the challenges are significant, and we need resources to take on those challenges and more people to do it. I'm really excited about the community-based elements of our work. So, for example, right now, in terms of that resource expansion at CLF, we now have a dedicated environmental justice advocate in Manchester and a dedicated environmental justice advocate in Nashua.
Wow.
So full-time staff working in just those two communities, and they're doing terrific work. And the idea was not for us to come into those communities and say, here are the problems that need to be fixed. It was to have staff who are connected to those communities,
right,
and to work with those communities to build an advocacy community.
Yeah.
Basically to engage the community to identify what the community considers to be the most significant challenges,
Sure.
health impacts, environmental impacts, and then work together to identify the solutions and work alongside the community in securing, in actually solving those problems.
That's pretty cool. That's actually quite a victory in my view, and a victory in the opportunity that it provides, right? Like, obviously just stationing someone there is not like, whoopee, we're done.
Yep. Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
No, it's an ongoing effort. And none of the issues we work on are solved
Yeah.
overnight.
Right.
Yeah, it's often a long-term commitment.
What?
And I was going to say, for example, our work in the Great Bay Estuary. I mean, that started in 2004, 2005, and we're still at it. As I mentioned, we've used the law to change the regulatory landscape and to ensure significant infrastructure improvements.
Yeah.
But we also have a fantastic Great Bay Piscataqua waterkeeper, Melissa Paley, here in the community. She's out and about connecting with people, building relationships, and in working with municipalities to continue that progress.
She should come on Granite Goodness.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I feel like there is progress there as well. I mean, this maybe isn't the perfect barometer for it, but I remember when I did live in Newmarket, like I would get from the town, they'd send me in the mail and they'd say, hey, be careful about the fertilizer. If you use any fertilizer on your lawn, like don't use too much, etc. Like there's a conversation happening, and I don't think that was happening in even in recent memory. Tom, what's your favorite part of working at the Conservation Law Foundation?
Certainly the people I get to work with. We have amazing staff, deeply dedicated to the work they're doing. The creativity that CLF staff bring to their work is inspiring. The creativity and persistence, because as I said before, the issues we work on are challenging issues and can take time.
Yeah.
So yeah, the people I get to work with are the favorite, my favorite part of my work.
Yeah.
And then also just having the impact that we have had working, as I said, to reduce pollution in a significant way from wastewater treatment plants in the Seacoast Estuary, the Great Bay Estuary. Working again to move New Hampshire off of dirty fossil fuels and towards a clean energy economy. We had an important win not long ago as a result of a lawsuit that CLF and Sierra Club brought against the owner of the last two coal-fired power plants in New England.
Oh, I always hear about these places.
Yeah.
They're always in the news on NHPR, these two coal plants.
Yeah.
But they're getting shut down or something, right?
So, yes, as a result of a settlement that we reached, they have enforceable closure dates.
Yeah.
So by mid-2028 at the latest, possibly a year before that, Merrimack Station, which is really the last operating coal-fired power plant, will shut down, and New England will be coal-free.
Wow. Do you think they're going to mail you a lump of coal as a memento? Maybe not. As your Christmas present, right?
If it were the last lump of coal that before it goes into the hopper,
that'd be kind of cool.
That
actually.
would be cool.
Yeah, you could put that in your office.
Yeah. But I don't think they will.
You could just get one and tell people. They wouldn't know. That would be awesome. All right, tell me a little bit. Do you collaborate with other like organizations in New England? Like, tell me about some of the partnerships that you have.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, for example, right here on the Great Bay Estuary, we are part of a group called Great Bay 2030, CLF, the Nature Conservancy, the National Estuarine Research Reserve, actually the Department of Environmental Services, and others are working together to make sure that investments, philanthropic investments in the estuary are made in an effective way to reduce pollution, engage the public more in protecting the estuary. So that's one example where we're partnering with several other organizations. In terms of our environmental justice work in Nashua and in Manchester, we are always looking for opportunities to partner with members of the community. So Granite State Organizing Project, for example, has a presence in both Nashua and Manchester. They're a grassroots-oriented, community-based group, and we partner with them, for example.
You mentioned Sierra Club too, was in there. It's always fun to hear like there's a whole kind of quilt of these organizations and the role that they play in supporting each other and interacting. All right, Tom, is there anything that you like really wanted to talk about that you feel like we didn't get a chance to cover?
So I'll just return to the theme of local impact.
Sure.
And the fact that really positive impact can happen at the local level. And the more engaged people are within their communities, reaching out to their state legislators, the more progress we'll make on these issues. Because even if, for example, we encounter headwinds at the federal level and a lack of support on certain issues there, at the local level and at the state level, we can make progress, and people in their communities can absolutely make a difference in that.
Well, that's a very good message on which to end. Thank you very much, Tom, for coming on Granite Goodness today.
Thank you, Andy. I enjoyed it. I appreciate your having me.
It's been real fun. We'll have to have you or someone else from your organization on again. You could tell us all the latest and greatest things going on.
That would be great.
At CLF,
Absolutely.
New Hampshire. All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Hey there, thanks for spending some time with us, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation. You can learn more about today's guest and how to get involved with or support their work in the show notes. If you'd like to suggest a guest for the show or have any story tips for our Good News in New Hampshire newsletter, shoot me a message at hello@granitegoodness.com. Music for this episode was provided by the band Sneaky Miles, who hail from Newmarket, New Hampshire. Until next time, I'm the creator and host of Granite Goodness, Andy DeMeo. Thanks for listening.